I've never heard of the Gothamist magazine or newspaper, but somebody sent me an article that really caught my attention. For the first time ever, a dog was not considered property by a judge and therefore by the courts. And who to go to better than Christopher Berry, the CEO of the Human Rights Project, who was a part of helping the court understand the value of animals in society. Christopher, I followed the work you've been doing for a very long time, a lot of it on behalf of, in particular, is it a gorilla? You've been doing a lot of work, and I've never invited you on because it just seemed a little outside the sort of parameters of dog talk, but you've been doing amazing work for a long time. Is it a gorilla?
The Nonhuman Rights Project is primarily done legal advocacy on behalf of chimpanzees and elephants. We brought lawsuits under a common law doctrine called habeas corpus, means like show the body,
Mhm.
and it's a way of challenging unlawful or wrongful detention of an individual who we've argued includes chimpanzees and elephants. So that's what the Non-Human Rights Project is most well known for within the animal advocacy sphere.
And why did you pick elephants? Chimpanzees, I can understand because everyone goes, oh, yeah, they're just like us, and people are so people-centric. It's hard for them to step out. We all know elephants are very smart and have very strong social relationships with each other and memories and all that. But why did you pick elephants?
Because that's really what where the law itself is telling us to go. So the whole argument in our habeas corpus theory is that the law doesn't care about human power and human privilege, right? Even though, of course, it's exercised through humans and through human political institutions. But what the law really cares about what is liberty. And
Okay.
who can appreciate liberty, or what are the qualities of someone who appreciates liberty, right? It's not only being human that matters, although all humans should have liberty, but it's also the fact that the entity they're autonomous, they plan for the future, they remember the past, they have family members and social bonds, a culture even, right? In the case of elephants and chimpanzees, as well as other non-human animals as well, such as like cetaceans, they can even recognize themselves in the mirror. So this is sentience, consciousness, they suffer, and elephants, chimpanzees, there's some non-human animals pass this bar quite easily. And so we're telling the courts and asking them, look, recognize the liberty of these animals, and let's not discriminate purely on the fact that someone happens to be non-human.
Someone happens to be not human. I also refer to dogs as people or as not as things, as does pretty much everybody on the planet Earth, not to mention the people listening to the show. So we have this case that it pricked my ears up that you were involved, but it's a really interesting case. We have an interesting sad. This 4-year-old, or was it, I don't forget how old Duke was, but he was a dachshund walking with a woman and her son on a leash crossing a street, and a driver did not look both ways or signal that he was going to turn, and he ran the Duke over and killed him right in front of the people. Talk a little about the law and how previously, when something like that has happened, the value of buying a dachshund, if that's where they got him from a breeder, we hope, not a pet store, that would be the only thing that driver would have to compensate. But this judge went above and beyond. But there were some interesting theoretical legal issues similar to the ones you're just talked about in terms of the chimps and the elephants. So talk about how you got involved and why this case is more important than just for the owners of Duke.
Yeah, so to really understand that, we have to go back hundreds of years to the foundational principles of our what we would call like our tort system, or this is part of the civil law, right? If someone hits you with a car and you become injured and lose work, you can s- get damages from them if they acted negligently, if they acted unreasonably. And the whole purpose of this area of law is to provide a compensation to the victim of wrongdoing. And we say, look, if you're texting while driving and you hit someone, that's wrongdoing, right? That you did something wrong, you hurt someone, you should pay for it. And that's the foundational principle. Now, with how does this relate to dogs?
Mhm.
So normally, if someone destroys your property, that you're entitled to the market value of the property, but no more. So if your car gets totaled, you don't you don't get enough money to, uncrinkle the body and rebuild the entire thing, which may cost many times more than what the car would be worth brand new. Instead, you get the market value of the car, you go buy something comparable. And normally this works. However, uh, and traditionally, this is what has applied to animals as well. So historically, animals were not really thought of as much as part of the family, but more so almost like a piece of farm equipment, right? Like a security system. You'd have a dog that would bark when someone entered your property, or you might have um, an ox that helps to pull your plow or something. And so when they die, it would be like replacing almost as like a tractor or something. And the issue is that in our modern society, non-human animals, our companion animals, our pets, our cats, our dogs, we don't view them as just a piece of like farm equipment or a security system anymore. They're a part of the family. And so limiting the recovery for wrongdoing involving the death of a family member to their market value is creates these absurd consequences. And the legal system has been slow to really, in my view, not create new law, but to just to catch up with itself, to catch up to its own centuries old principle that a victim should is entitled to reasonable compensation when they're the victim of wrongdoing.
So the victim in this case, however, wasn't really Duke. The victim was the woman. And as I read it, again, in the Gothamist, so not one of your legal briefs, but it was because she was tethered by the leash to the dog and witnessed his death that she was entitled to emotional damages. Is that right? If he had been off leash, even if the driver was completely in the wrong, was the leash it was so strange to me that the tethering by the leash somehow made her emotional distress worse or legally made it more binding. I don't want everyone to think, oh, good, now my animals are, that the law respects them like I do, because it doesn't seem like it will.
Yeah, so uh as we like to say, especially in the animal lawyer space, the wheels of justice move slowly. And so this is really an example of that. And there's sort of 2 points I want to respond to in that. I'll respond to the most immediate point first, which is the fact that the significance of Duke being leashed at the time. And the reason that was significant is because there have, over the last many decades, as you might imagine, now that dogs, cats, pets, whatever, are considered part of the family, people view them as such. There have been a lot of cases where people have tried going beyond the market value to
Mhm.
obtain some emotional distress from having witnessed it, or like the loss of companionship, right? Loss of that sort of emotional harm, or sometimes it's framed as like a sentimental damage, like a family heirloom, for example. There have been a lot of cases, and people just keep bringing them. But there are some from the 80s, 90s, 2000s where courts have reviewed this and said we're just gonna stick to the old way of doing things where the animal is just property, and we're not going to update the law to reflect our common notions. And so in New York, there was one of these cases where under somewhat similar circumstances, someone's dog was killed in front of them. I think maybe even from a car, and emotional distress claim was denied.
Okay.
And what seems like what happened here is that the judge in this case was like, this is unjust, right? The judge knew, as probably hope what I was presume almost everyone, if not everyone listening to this is thinking, which is like this is like an unfair system.
Right.
And there was even video footage in this case as well that the judge saw that was part of the record. So he saw the dog die, and he saw the family reacting to it on video, and distinguished this case from the old case, not saying not saying that we're going to create new law, we're going to overturn old precedent, but that we're going to make a distinction that in this situation where the dog was tethered and there was even more of an immediate threat to the human walking the dog,
Right.
that in this case we're not bound by past precedent on under these facts. And so the court, I think, very smartly and cleverly made this a very narrow holding, which was because this exact fact pattern hasn't been decided already, you, he's not going out of bounds. He's just applying the law to these particular facts and finding that under these circumstances, emotional distress damages were available.
So is this one brick in a wall that you're trying to build? A wall that we climb over and see daylight on the other side? Because if it's the tethering to the woman and it's her emotional distress, it's no law. The issue is not, hey, what's a little dachshund's real value to those people who live with him and love him? It turns out it's really the woman's distress isn't about the value of the dachshund, it's the how much she has suffered, her suffering.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and important nuance, right? That it's not just the dog, but there's really an entanglement going on in a way that this is about the legal status of the dog is whether they're a family member or not. And that was really part of a key part of this holding as well, which was these emotional distress claims are only available if you watch an immediate family member die in front of you. It's not just like a random stranger who
In
gets hit by a
in
car.
human terms, like walking with my child or aunt, and she or he gets killed by a gun or a car or something. It's only that I witnessed it that makes my emotional distress more
That
valuable.
yeah, that you witnessed it, that you were there when it happened, that kind of say in the zone of danger.
Okay.
And that they were an immediate family member. So it's all those things together. It's like it's reasonable to have experienced emotional distress, and we're gonna allow you to obtain financial compensation for that under those circumstances. And so in this case, it was the dog was a family member. And
That's a big deal. That is the big deal payoff in terms of your years of work and that of other legal entities working on behalf of animals. They've said that is a family member. It doesn't matter where there was a leash, what the dollar amount is, certainly emotional distress, but it's the acknowledgement that's a family member. Isn't that a huge win?
yeah, it's extremely big. And the family, uh, Duke's family I think it even posted on social media. I don't know them personally, but they posted on social media that that there's something dignifying about that, just having that be recognized. And it really cuts to the heart of a broader cultural, social, legal conversation we're having, which is what is the status of animals in our society? Are we going to treat them as these sort of market value things?
Right.
Are they going to have a different status? Maybe it's not no one's called for a right to vote or something. So maybe it's not like the sort of full-fledged voting citizen sort of legal status, but is there something maybe in between where you can recognize that they suffer, that we shouldn't be inflicting gratuitous suffering, that they should have a legal status to protect themselves from that. They can also form family bond units with humans and have that legal status of being a family member. Or are we going to deny these things? Which in my view is almost a form of gaslighting, saying that the sky's orange when it's clearly blue. To say that Duke's not a family member, or that Happy the elephant that she doesn't care about her liberty, that she's not suffering at the zoo.
Which has been a harder one for you to prove.
Yeah, they're different, but there's a similarity too, which is
Right, but I'm just mean you as a lawyer, a passionate lawyer with a high moral ground, that's still harder because people are used to seeing unhappy, if you will, the elephant in these horrible small cement enclosures in zoos with no life, cut off from all of her members of her species, no natural stimulation, all the awful things that zoos can be and are trying to be less of, the good ones as time goes on. That's got to be harder for you to prove or for a lawyer to prove than that that dog is definitely a family member and the emotional bond is palpable, measurable, provable in whatever way would be required.
yeah, it's hard all around. I've actually been quite shocked at the amount of resistance to even recognizing this dogs as family members in circumstances similar to this. I'm quite surprised because something like 90% of Americans who have pets, cats and dogs in particular, I don't know if they've polled other ones, that American Veterinary Medical Association, which ironically filed a brief against us, against dogs being family members, they had their own poll showed, I think it was 86% of Americans who said that their cats and dogs were members of the family and not property, that they weren't property. So it's quite,
A number of those studies, and they keep saying it to those of us who have been living that truth forever. Yeah, what's your point? There is a point to those studies, isn't there? And to those statistics, because they help bolster legal arguments that are protection.
yeah, it's not just the judge feeling the vibes, as it were, because they
Right,
love their dog. Although I think
right.
that certainly can be helpful, right? If the judge has that sort of perspective, but it's also this is how society feels about it. And in fact, that's one of the things courts are supposed to take into account
Really?
when they issue these rulings. Yeah, what are the prevailing societal norms? What does the evidence say? We have this original principle that you're supposed to compensate victims of wrongdoings,
Right.
and then along the way, courts decided which includes animals, that that it's not reasonable to be compensated for emotional distress for that. And then there's this question of how do we know that's still good? How do we know that's still true? And courts are supposed to think about things like fairness,
Sure. I didn't
equality,
know that.
justice. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. And in this decision, and courts have been really hesitant to do that. I think there's a stigma against what's called an activist judge. But in my view, by denying the role of like justice and fairness and like prevailing societal like norms, by ignoring that and refusing to advance the law when it's desperately needs to be advanced, I actually think that's its own form of activism, where they're actually just that's a form of activism of stifling the justice system and creating barriers to justice that aren't supposed to exist.
So I didn't know this. You're saying that a judge makes a ruling not necessarily based on prior law, prior rulings, but has to take into account what is going on in the real world? I
Yes,
didn't.
and but I'll put an asterisk on that, a couple of asterisks, but the main one is that is true for common law. So
Ah,
so there's if it was just purely a question of statutory interpretation, let's say that the state of New York or wherever had created a statute that was about the dogs, like that would be one matter. This is common law, and it can be a little complicated to figure out what parts of the law are covered by common law versus statutory or so forth. But particularly in the realm of common law, yes, that's a consideration that's supposed to be taken into account.
okay. So what happens when my neighbor, my cranky neighbor, is really annoyed that my dogs bark at passing traffic and throws poisoned meat, and we have a Ring doorbell camera showing he threw poisoned meat and killed my dogs? Does this ruling on behalf of the dachshund who's killed by a car in front of the lady, and I come out and I see my dog dying of poisoning, God forbid, do ca would I be able to sue in the same way this family sued?
First and foremost, I would advise someone to get a lawyer in a situation like that because there are 50 states, and so the rules can be different depending on where you're at or what's going on. So my really broad, evasive answer is it depends. Maybe a more a more like responsive answer is that actually in that situation where it's intentional,
Yes.
where they're targeting you intentionally, courts do allow what's known as like punitive damages, right? So that's we're gonna punish you because not just because you like mess up, there's accidents and bad things happen, and sometimes we're gonna make you pay for that. But if you're intentionally doing this, we're gonna punish you beyond this kind of reasonable harm analysis. And there have been cases where that includes emotional distress for animals, but that's where someone intentionally is, I'm going to kill your animal. Uh, Maybe another analogy would be this was an actual case out of Wyoming from a few years ago, which is horrifying. A family and their three St. Bernards were out hiking, and they alleged that someone set illegal snare traps that were too close to the hiking trail. All three of the dogs were ensnared and died in front of the family, and they sued.
Ah,
Again, this wasn't they weren't trying to ensnare the dogs; they were trying to presumably
that's
and
something else and torture it. Yeah.
sure, yeah, which something that was maybe more legally. permissible. But regardless, the dogs died, and they argued that the rules weren't being followed for these snare traps. So they sued for emotional distress, and it went to the Wyoming Supreme Court, and the Wyoming Supreme Court stuck with the old rule and said no emotional damage for you, just market value for those dogs.
What
Uh,
about the woman who came on this show a couple of years ago? Her story was in the New York Times, walking her little white poodle. And a woman who owned, I believe, a bookshop on the Upper East Side had three German Shepherd, very vicious, proven that they had attacked many other dogs that lived in her basement. She came out and her three dogs mangled and murdered the little white poodle right in front of this other lady. Did she? So that's New York. Would she have recourse different than what she had, which was none, now that this ruling has been made?
I think what this ruling does, maybe this is probably the best answer to your question. What it does is it signals that that the status quo, that the traditional way of doing things doesn't seem to be right. It doesn't seem to actually reflect our morals. There's a fluidity, there's like music, so we'll say a phase transition, right? Sort of there's a phase shift that's happening right now.
Mhm.
And this opinion is, I think, a milestone opinion because of how it highlights that transition that we're undergoing. And so it's hard to say in this state or that state, or what about this fact or this fact. All of it's going to be a little bit of it depends, and I'm not sure. But what this case does is it's proof that there is a shift that's happening,
Yes.
and that there's an openness, a need, and now precedential support for re-examining these old assumptions that seem to not be working, and to adapt them to our current time.
So it is important. It is a milestone, and it's something that we can all applaud. And I'm happy for you that it's happening in your lifetime, because since the law does move slowly, it's possible you could spend your life as a lawyer and as an advocate for animals and feel that you would maybe move the ball down the field, as it were, an inch. But now it seems like this has moved it a whole lot of yards in terms of a brick, a stone on which you can continue to build a better foundation for a newer view of animals.
Yeah, it's difficult, and it can be frustrating that it's slow. The thing is that someone has to ask to do the thing in order for the ask to be granted. And oftentimes, especially with a sort of transformational change, there's a knee-jerk reaction against you, that you have to get the knee-jerk reflexes out of the system. And that can take a long time, years or decades even. But it's important that it be done. It's important that we go through this process, and that we have a legal system that's about justice, that's really what this is about.
That's
A
that's
legal system that does justice for animals.
That's a lovely way of putting it. And I really admire your lifetime of work on behalf of justice for animals. And I'm happy for you and for all the animals for whom you speak, as well as for dog and in some cases cat owners, that this decision has been made. And we hope that kind of thinking will permeate, will seep in between the cracks of the old and cause a new tomorrow. Thank you so much, Christopher Berry, and thanks for all the good work of the Non-Human Rights Project.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if people are interested, you go to nonhumanrights.org or follow us on social media at the same handle, and stay up to date for what'll hopefully be good news in the future as well.
That's right. The more people who watch and listen and care and donate any amount, all of that is to the good. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.